On a bright afternoon in eastern Belgium this month, the flames along a nature reserve called the High Fens were finally dying down. The firefighters had not won, because the fire that mattered here was never really the flames on top. It was underground, in the ground itself, and it was still burning. I'm Alex, and this is Unseen Systems. A peat fire can smolder underground for weeks, sometimes months, long after the surface looks black and cold. And here is the strange part: you can pour water straight onto it and barely touch it. So this is a fire with almost no flame that eats ground thousands of years old and shrugs off the one thing we always reach for. To understand why, you have to look at what is actually down there. That ground is peat. Peat is not soil, and it is not yet coal. It is plants that died and never finished rotting. In a bog, the ground is waterlogged, airless and acidic, so dead moss and roots pile up faster than they can break down. Instead of returning to the air as carbon dioxide, that carbon simply stays. Layer on layer, it stacks up. And it stacks up slowly. A healthy bog gains only about a millimetre of peat a year. The exact rate changes from bog to bog, but hold that one number because it does the heavy lifting. A millimetre a year means a single metre of peat took roughly 1,000 years to form. The deep bogs run several metres down, the deepest over 10. This is a carbon archive thousands of years old. Now widen out. Peatlands cover only about 3% of the planet's land, but packed into that thin skin of ground is a staggering share of all the carbon held in the world's soils, more than you would ever guess from the surface. Here is how the International Union for Conservation of Nature sums up the scale of what is down there.
Peat soils contain more than 600 gigatonnes of carbon, which represents up to 44% of all soil carbon, and exceeds the carbon stored in all other vegetation types, including the world's forests.
So this is the fuel, not the sticks and heather on the surface, but this deep, ancient, carbon-dense ground underneath it. A bog spends thousands of years quietly building it, one slow millimetre at a time, and a fire, once it gets down into it, can eat through meters of it in a matter of weeks, built over millennia, gone in a single season. But one thing has to happen first. A living bog is far too wet to burn. The water is the whole defense. The danger comes when that water leaves, when the land is drained for farming or forestry, or a long drought pulls the water table down. Dry the peat out, and you have quietly turned a fireproof sponge into the largest fuel store on land. Now the peat is dry and something sets it off, a surface fire, a lightning strike, even hot machinery. And now the ground does something wood never does. It does not catch into flame, it smoulders. Flameless and glowing, with the oxygen attacking the solid carbon directly, right there on its surface. No fire you would recognize from above, just heat and a slowly creeping edge. And smoldering is strange in two ways. First, it is cool. A flaming wildfire runs around 1500 degrees Celsius. A smoldering peat front sits at maybe 500 to 600. Second, it is slow. It creeps through the ground at centimeters an hour, sideways and downward, following the dry carbon wherever it happens to lade. But cool and slow does not mean weak. Smoldering is self-sustaining. Once it is going, it makes its own heat, dries the peat just ahead of itself, and keeps moving, with no wind needed and no fresh flame needed. Put the surface fire completely out, and days later this can climb back up somewhere else and light it again. Firefighters call them zombie fires. What decides whether it keeps going is water. How much is still left in the peat? Above roughly 55% moisture, the ground usually cannot sustain a smolder. The water soaks up too much of the heat. Drop below that, and it feeds itself. That is the whole grim logic of it. The drier the ground gets, the more unstoppable the fire that lives inside it. So how long can this go on? Weeks is ordinary, months happens. In deep peat, a fire can smolder right through from one year into the next, and surface again long after everyone assumed it was out. The scale of it is genuinely hard to overstate, which is why Guillermo Rain, the fire scientist who studies exactly this, reaches for a phrase that sounds like exaggeration and simply is not. He calls smoldering peat fires the largest fires on Earth, not the tallest flames. By that measure, they barely register. The largest by the sheer mass of fuel they consume, burning through more carbon per square metre than any forest fire above them. On the order of 15% of humanity's greenhouse emissions in a given year come out of ground that is quietly smouldering like this. Which brings us to the obvious question. If it is a fire in the ground, why not just soak the ground, pour on water, flood it, done? Except that is exactly what does not work, and the reason is a property of dried peat that most people have never heard of. When peat dries out and heats up, it turns water-repellent, hydrophobic. Think of how the dry soil in a neglected plant pot behaves. Pour water on, and it runs off the top instead of soaking in. Dried peat does the same thing, only worse. Water hitting it does not spread out and sink evenly. It finds a few cracks and channels, races straight down through them, and runs off the sides, right past the smoldering pockets it was supposed to drown. And you end up needing enormous amounts of water for almost no effect. In controlled tests, putting out a patch of smoldering peat with plain water took somewhere around 16 to 24 litres for every single square metre, and most of even that just channeled away. The fire sits centimetres from the water and never actually gets wet. Plain water, on its own, is close to the wrong tool. So crews stop fighting it from the top and drive it from below instead. Long hollow lances, essentially spears, are pushed down into the peat so that water or foam comes out at the burning layer itself, not on the surface above it. You are no longer hoping the water finds its own way down. You are putting it exactly where the fire is. And they change the water itself. Add a wetting agent, essentially a soap, and you lower the water's surface tension, so instead of beating up and channeling away, it spreads out, clings, and soaks in. Now the same water can actually reach the carbon. In those same tests, the treated water needed only about 4 to 7 litres a square metre, a fraction of the plain water amount. It is not only about volume, though, it is about time, which on a fire that can outlast a season is everything. When researchers at Imperial College London tested one of these suppressants against exactly the smouldering zombie fires we met earlier, the headline result was blunt.
Magical fire suppressant clears zombie fires 40% faster than water alone.
Step back and you can see why a few thousand hectares of burning bog is not a small story. Because a peat fire is not just hard to stop, it is emptying a vault. The clearest measure of that came out of Indonesia, where enormous peat fires burned through the drought of 1997, and scientists later added up the carbon that went into the sky. The figure, published in Nature, is staggering.
Between 0.81 and 2.57 gigatonnes of carbon, equivalent to 13 to 40% of the mean annual global carbon emissions from fossil fuels.
And it does not take the tropics. In 2010, peat fires on less than 500 hectares of drained, abandoned bog outside Moscow put more smoke into the air than many thousands of hectares of burning forest, and during that summer's smog the city's daily death toll roughly doubled, under 500 hectares. The common thread, every single time, is the same: ground that had been drained. Strip away the smoke, and the surprising thing is this. A peat fire is not dangerous because it burns hot, it barely does. It is dangerous because it burns slow and low and hidden inside a fuel we spent thousands of years storing safely underwater. So the fight is never really against a flame at all. It is against the ground itself, one buried metre at a time. So back to that reserve in Belgium, its surface finally gone quiet. Somewhere under the black, the real fire may still be moving, slow and flameless, with crews driving lances into the ground for weeks yet. When you next hear that a wildfire is out, picture the front that might still be creeping through the dark meters below, the fire with no flame. Thanks for watching.